we will be talking about the strategic management process for this particular session. Now, previously, you would have an idea of the principles of planning. So that idea, that concept would be some sort of a springboard to this particular topic, which is the strategic management process. Okay? And what is strategic management as a whole? Okay? Well, strategic management or the strategic management process is a method by which managers conceive of and implement a strategy that can lead to a sustainable competitive advantage. In the old days, the word sustainable wasn't really a highlight of the literature. People back then, managers, leaders, were content with just coming up with a competitive advantage. Now, decades have passed. They realized that while a company, company X, for example, had the competitive advantage back 20, 30 years ago, company X now is no longer existing. So that sort of shook the core of the literature, of the field. Why is it that company X having a sustainable advantage back then didn't survive now? So this is why the additional adjective sustainable is put into the mix. And you can see the relationship between the previous topic on planning to this topic on strategic management. So definitely, the sense of deliberation is important when we want to be executing or managing people from a strategic standpoint. And with that, the idea of strategic planning comes into the picture. Okay, and well, what is strategic planning, or what is strategic planning process? Okay, it's a systematic or emerged way of performing strategic planning, okay, in the organization through initial assessment, thorough analysis, strategy formulation, implementing the strategy, and monitoring and evaluating it. Uh, Planning as a generic activity, okay, or as a generic concept in the overall framework of management. As you know, it's one of the four: planning, leading, organizing, controlling. Strategic planning gives a little bit more uh, emphasis on the fact that it's more global, meaning you're looking at the entire organization more. At the same time, it is a structured activity. It's a structured process, as we say it, that there are certain steps that need to be done. Okay, I wouldn't want to say need to be done, because really it's the leaders of the organization that would feel the need or the responsibility to actually go through this exercise. But uh, the point being is that strategic planning, relative to planning per se, is that it's phased, it's planned, it's much more deliberate, it's more detailed, okay? And it really affects an entire organization versus a small group. Okay. Now we go right in to the strategic planning process. Okay, so if you are a leader who is responsible for coming up with a strategic plan for an organization, if you recall, there are three levels or three types of plans: your strategic plan, your tactical plan, and your operational plan. Now we go and zero in on strategic plan. And what's the process behind the strategic plan? Well, again, we're seeing another straight line, a linear process composed of five phases this time around. Initial assessment is the first one, followed by situation analysis, and then strategy formulation, and then coming up with the implementation of the strategy, and lastly, strategy monitoring. Now, unlike the other processes that you have seen as far as management goes, this particular process is a little bit more strict as far as linearity is concerned. What do I mean? It is possible that there would not be any rollbacks or revert to the previous phase if something goes wrong. Generally, it's like a gated process wherein when you're done with one phase, you go through a gate to the next phase, and that's it. You don't anymore go back to the previous phases. That is more or less what you will expect in a typical strategic planning process. Now, there are many reasons why linearity is a little bit more strict in a strategic planning process. Well, for one, it destroys or dilutes the effectiveness of strategy as a whole. Okay. Secondly, you'd want to be a little bit more robust in trying to implement your strategies. If you always have to keep on going back and revising your plan, your strategy, okay, your strategic plan along the way, then it gives the organization some sort of anxiety. The organization wouldn't really know, okay, what's really our objective right now? Tomorrow it might be something else already, or next week, all the more it's going to be something different. So you would expect the strategic planning process to be a little bit more stable, that when you go from one phase to another, you'd expect that you need to complete everything first before you go back to the first stage. Okay. And that's why strategic planning processes happen on an annual basis. Sometimes they happen once every few years. Some organizations would have a strategic planning process once every 5 years, every 6 years, every 8 years. Okay. And then what's happening every year would be the monitoring part. Okay. Now let's take a look at each of these parts. Okay. But I will be zeroing in on the first two phases, because the last three phases, strategy formulation, okay, that's really pretty much your strategic plan. And that's something that would have been discussed in the earlier portions or earlier sessions on the principles of planning. Strategy implementation, that is a topic that would be dealt in more depth when you start thinking of project management and the likes, because strategy implementation is all about execution. And that's the same thing also with strategy monitoring. It's really just trying to observe and gather data. And a lot of these things in strategy monitoring can be dealt in a different subject, which will not be the scope for today's session. So let's go first with the first phase, which is initial assessment. Okay. The starting point of this process is an assessment. Okay. And here, this is where the managers must clearly identify or define two things: the vision and the mission of the company. You probably have heard of this in the past. Perhaps you've been attending student orgs or extracurricular groups or clubs, and they typically share what the vision and mission of that group would be, right? You've probably attended a lot of these orientation sessions, these onboarding sessions with these groups, and somehow, some way, they will insert a topic about the vision and mission of the organization, of that group or of that club. Well, it's important that the organization has a vision and a mission, because that's where everything uh, is based from. That's what gives life or spirit to all the activities and tasks that's happening within the organization. Now, what is vision? Or specifically, what is organizational vision? Well, it answers the question, a very simple question: what does an organization want to become? So it's like an introspection, or it's like the organization looking in a mirror, in front of a mirror, and then looking beyond the reflection and coming up with something imaginative for itself. So this is really more being, or ontological, if we use a philosophical term, as to what the organization will be. Okay, being, what will the organization be? Okay. And vision, visualizing, the act of seeing things, seeing the future, you'll see the metaphors. Uh, in this case, without that activity or without that exercise of visualizing the future of the company, managers wouldn't know where they want to go and what they have to achieve. That makes sense. Even in your own personal lives, sometimes as you were growing up, you were asked about your ambitions or dreams. Simply put, right? You dream to be something. Okay, well, that's also a vision. That's a personal vision for yourself. And you've noticed if you've been true to your vision, to your dreams, to your ambitions, everything that you've done since then should actually be aligned to that vision or that dream or that ambition of yours. Okay. So, in a similar vein, an organizational vision, is the ultimate goal for the company, for the firm, and it provides direction for everyone in the organization, its employees, particularly its leaders. No matter who would be the leader or who would be the employees down the road. As you know, leaders can change. You can have a different president, a different set of managers along the way. You can have a different set of employees. Employees get hired, employees resign. Okay, so at any given point in time, the composition of your organization changes, but the vision shouldn't. Okay, there could be some changes, there could be some updating that would happen, but generally the vision tends to be a little bit more independent of the composition of the organization. Okay. Now, what about the mission? What is organizational mission? Well, mission describes the company's business, what they do. So if vision is to be, mission is to do. Okay. It informs the stakeholders about the products, customers, markets, values, reputation, uh, concern for public image, and employees of the organization. Okay. Now, a mission statement that is thorough can actually give some sort of guide for the leaders and managers in making appropriate daily decisions. So, this is what we've been talking about earlier, wherein the vision and the mission informs and motivates all the activities within the organization, independent on who would be in that organization at any given point in time. Okay. Now, at the end of the first phase, which is the initial assessment phase, the organization should have crafted their mission and vision. So that is the deliverable for that phase. Typically, when you go in an existing organization that would have probably plastered their vision statement, their mission statement by the walls, the initial assessment would probably be just a review of the vision statements, the mission statements. There could be a little bit of updating. Okay? But needless to say, whether you're a new company or a mature company that would have an existing vision mission statement, it's important that everybody goes through that process of really understanding themselves. What is it that we want to be in the future, and what is it that we should be doing? And that is what would comprise your vision and mission. Later on, you will have a little bit of appreciation of how to go about with vision statements, with mission statements. There are a lot of tricks or techniques, perhaps, on how to really write down your vision statements or mission statements. I won't really go to those techniques at length. And coming up with these statements, it's not a hyper scientific method, right? There's an art to it as well. So I think it would be more of a disservice for me if I tell you, okay, this is the technique on how to do a mission statement. This is a technique on how to do a vision statement. Normally, the practice is they take a look at samples of vision statements, of mission statements. They try to model from those examples, and then they put in a little bit of input. along the way. Okay? And because it's a little bit of an art, there's really no accurate way to say that, okay, this is 100% correct vision, this is 100% correct mission statement. Why is that? Well, for one, a vision statement is something that's futuristic, right? It's a to be, it's aspirational. So there's really no way for you to determine at this point in time that the mission or the vision statement is correct. It's aspirational, it's something down the line, it's still something in the future. The only time that a vision statement is 100% wrong, okay, so to speak, is that if you've already attained that vision. In which case, you should challenge yourselves to come up with a new vision. But in general, nevertheless, if you haven't attained that vision, it's okay because it's aspirational. Now, what about the mission statement? How do you know if the mission statement is 100% correct or not? Well, there's a little bit of variability there. And that's where the idea of coming up with a plan comes in. Okay. But at the end of the day, you'll have to understand that these things, they can change over time, but they shouldn't be changing often. So it's very important that when you go through this initial assessment phase, it's supposed to be something a little bit more deliberate. You've given it, you and everybody else have given it some serious thought. And then at the end of it, okay, you settle and lock in, okay, this is the statements that I will work with. Now, going on to the next phase, which is analyzing the situation. Now that you've given a statement of your dreams, of what you want to be and what you'd like to do, okay, in the earlier phase, under initial assessment, you take a look at the situation, a situational analysis. Okay? It must assess the current situation of the market or where the company would like to play or participate in. Okay? And necessarily, this would include understanding and evaluating the organizational's environment, both internal environment and external environment. Okay? Even analyzing other players in that market, your so-called competitors. Okay? And of course, not just competitors, you're also going to take a look at your suppliers or partners. You also need to take a look at your customers, your market itself, right? And that's something that which was discussed in another previous session about Porter's 5 forces. So you understand that you don't only look at competitors, right? You also take a look at other factors. You look at possible entrants. You look at suppliers. You look also at customers, right? So you don't just look at competitors. And that's all part of your situation analysis. Now, let's take a look at the analysis of the external environment. Okay? So you don't take a look at the internal. So for the macro environment analysis, so much larger, like if you want to take a look at the situation of the country or even of the world, you take a look at the PESTLE or PESTLE framework. Okay? If you want to just drill down to the industry that you're in, you can use Porter's 5 forces framework. But when you zero in on just the competitors, ignoring in the meantime your suppliers, your customers, you can use what is known as CPM or competitor profile matrix, okay, and do some benchmarking. Okay. Now, what is the PESTLE analysis or PESTLE? So I think I skipped out. Okay, so we'll talk about the PESTLE analysis in a while. Okay, so that's for the external. For the internal, okay, you take a look at what's internal to you, the internal factors, okay, which includes assessment of the company's resources, core competencies, the activities that you do, okay, and you understand that in every organization, there are both tangible and intangible resources, okay. And there's a lot of literature that really talks about the intangibles, like culture, brand equity, knowledge, patents, copyrights, trademarks, intellectual property. These are all intangibles. And there's a healthy stock of literature that really discusses the intangible resources and their and the relevance to the success of an organization. Okay. The tangible resources, you would perhaps pick this up in a basic economics course, right? You know this to be capital, land, equipment, okay? And your core competencies and activities, this would be defined by your labor. Now, we'll go into your PESTLE or PESTLE analysis. So what is this PESTLE analysis? Well, it takes a look at political, economic, social, technological factors. Okay? In fact, PESTLE refers to 6 areas, right? So you have the political, economic, social, technological. So that's your PEST. What about your E and L? Okay. Back in the old days, it was just pest analysis. But as the literature grew, scholars realized that you have to take a look at 2 more things, right? You take a look at environment. So you take a look at nature, the natural environment, okay, and your effect and influence to that. At the same time, you take a look at the legal side, the law. Okay, it's different from political because political refers more to the people. Legal refers to the regulatory framework. Okay, so the 6 factors that comprise your external environment at a much larger level. Okay, that's your PESTLE analysis. Um, and it gives us a very good picture. I would say it's a little bit crude still. It's not going to give you a very exhaustive list of things to consider. But if you want to start somewhere, if you really want to take a look and do an effective external environment scan, then just take a look at these 6 factors. Maybe you just start with the first 4, right, with the PEST. So your political, economic, social, technological. And then later on, you can include environmental, and then legal. Right? Now, the aim of a PESTLE analysis, well, to find out the current external factors that would affect the organization. And at the same time, you will realize which of those factors that might change in the future, right? And then once you've identified those possibilities, then you start categorizing which ones are opportunities and which ones are threats. Okay? And the earlier you can identify these things, the easier it is for you to come up with a more timely approach. So if ever that factor would change, then at least you already know that it will change. You've already predicted it, right? You've done your analysis. It should be straightforward. Okay. Now, in order to perform PESTLE, managers have to gather as much relevant information as possible about the external environment. And this can be pretty heavy on the workload of people. Uh, that's why strategic planning is typically done by a team that has dedicated time and energy and effort to do this. Because this really is a lot of intel work, right? You really scan the market, gather as much data as you can, and then you you consolidate the data for the subsequent analysis of everybody. Now, another framework that would be important to take a look is SWOT. And this is the more familiar framework to us. SWOT, as we know, is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you take a look at 4 factors. Okay. Now, PESTLE is more external. So in other words, at the end of PESTLE should give you the O and the P. But what about the internal analysis? That's where the S and W will come into the picture. Okay. Typically, S and W, your strengths or weaknesses, I mean, there are many ways of trying to go about with it. Um, in a nutshell, it need not be very complicated. It need not be very detailed. I mean, it should be detailed to some degree, but it wouldn't need to be very exhaustive off the bat. I mean, you can always fill that up along the way. But strengths and weaknesses refer to the internal environment, opportunities and threats external. And your opportunities and threats would be better off derived from a PESTLE analysis. Okay? Now, strengths and weaknesses, where to look for them? And here's a list. You can see in front of you, okay, resources, the available resources you have, your core competencies, capabilities, people, your talent. Okay, you take a look at also your functional areas, what has been constructed already, what's out there. Culture, culture can be a strength. It can also be a weakness. They're part of your organization. And other value chain activities. If you're in a manufacturing company, well, things that really would define the production of a product. Okay. And this would be your sources of strengths or weaknesses. Now, how to identify a strength? Okay, you can use what is known as a VRIO framework. Okay, uh, a resource can be seen as a strength if it exhibits VRIO. Okay, so if it's valuable, if it's rare, okay, if it is something that cannot be imitated, right? So that is VRIO. Now, VRIO is, again, if you've noticed, it's another adjective. V stands for value, so it's valuable. R stands for rarity. I stands for imitability, and O stands for organization, or the ability to be orderly or organized. Okay. Okay. So if it exhibits all those four characteristics, it's valuable, it's rare, it cannot be imitated, it's something that can be organized, then it's a strength. Okay. Otherwise, it's a potential weakness. Now, opportunities and threats, we've talked about it. You can use the PESTLE analysis to derive your opportunities and threats. Now, when you go through the SWOT analysis, it's very basic. It's well, overly used, right? And it's something easy to do, but there are limitations to the analysis. You can come up with grocery lists upon grocery lists of each of the four, and it's not probably going to get you started right away. You can fall prey to the paralysis by analysis syndrome. So there's that risk that you can come up with just lists. Now, the factors, they are not prioritized right away. There's no immediate way for you to determine which one is more important than the others. And factors sometimes are described too broadly, they're not too specific. And factors, guess what? Because it is quite simple, they can be prone to opinions. It's a subjective assessment rather than something objective. And there doesn't seem to be any recognized method to distinguish strengths from weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So SWOT, in a nutshell, is highly subjective. And depending on who's doing the SWOT analysis, it can be quite solid. Perhaps the one who's doing the analysis is a matured analyst or individual, or it can be something that's flimsy, somebody who is inexperienced, immature, who doesn't have a broad understanding of both the internal and external markets. You can have a very flimsy SWOT analysis. Okay. Now, what are the typical guidelines when you're doing your SWOT analysis? Again, this is not a hard and fast rule. It's not a formula that you should really strictly follow. Okay, but there are some guides, some guidelines that would be important. Okay. Well, factors have to be identified relative to competitors. Later on, when we talk about CPM, okay, you would like to have factors that you can use also to compare with others, right? It allows specifying whether the factor is a strength or a weakness. Well, in terms of each category, so for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you just want to have a list between 3 to 5. You don't want to have a list that is so long. So, okay, I mean, that's something that you want to keep in mind as well. Okay. You want the items to be very, very clearly defined and specific as possible. Okay. And here's an example. I mean, brand image, still vague. Strong brand image, okay, a little bit more precise, but could be improved on. Okay. or a much longer strength at a brand image valued at $10 billion. So both describe the same reality, but how it's described spells a lot of difference. And rely on facts, not on opinions. Okay? So find some external information or involve someone who could provide an unbiased opinion. Okay? And the factors should be action orientated. Okay? It should actually lead you to do something rather than just an abstract appreciation of the same reality, right? So that those are the guidelines when you want to do SWOT analysis. Now, the thing there is, just like any other method, you can exhibit mastery of the SWOT analysis if you keep on doing it. So at the start, you may not really get it right. That's fine. Just keep on doing it, keep on refining it until you get the hang of it. Now we move to another tool, which is the competitive profile matrix or CPM. So as we said earlier, this really just focuses on the competitor and your relative position with them, right? So it compares the firm and its rivals and reveals the relative strengths and weaknesses. So you can look at it as some sort of a table, okay? And then, okay, you have all the competitors and then all of the dimensions that you'd like to compare yourselves with, and then there's like some sort of a rating. Are you a plus, a plus plus, a minus, minus minus? Okay, there are many ways of doing CPM, and it compares them using the industry's critical success factors. So you don't really put everything there. I mean, you just put the ones that are critical to what is considered as a success in that industry. It reveals, in principle, it should reveal relative strength and weakness. They're not absolute, meaning both of you can be weak on the absolute, but you can be slightly stronger than that other competitor, for example. So in that sense, that's a relative strength. Okay, but in a certain benchmark, or if you use a different reference, you're probably weak. Both of you are weak, right? So it's relative strength and weakness. Okay. So a company would know which areas it should improve and which areas to protect. The thing with CPM is that it gives a little bit of grounding as far as your organization goes, right? If you find yourself to be in the middle of the pack, like there are 10 competitors, 10 of you in that industry, you're not number one. Let's say you're number 5 or number 6. A more reasonable approach is that while it might be very exciting to be number 1 in the industry, it doesn't make practical sense to try to do everything and be number 1 right away. You'd probably want to move up 1 step or 2 steps at a time. Right? Okay, if you're number 6, maybe you look at the number 5. Okay, how do I become the new number 5? What would be the things that are missing? Maybe those are the easier things that you can do. Okay. Then after you go with number 5, then you take a look at number 4. Okay, what's number 4 going to be right now? Okay. And then you work towards that. You don't try to aspire right away to hit number 1. Although if you feel based on your analysis that you can really replace number 1, then go ahead, right? But pragmatically speaking, you just take a look at what's above you immediately, right? Who's above you in rank, try to beat that organization, that company, and then okay, you're on your way to your next objective. So that's the beauty of the CPM. It gives you a good picture of where you are in the pack, and gives you an idea. Okay, my path to success would mean that I have to pick one off one at a time. Okay, another metaphor that's useful here is like when you're in racing, car racing, right? You overtake cars one at a time. You don't just try to boost your way right away to number 1, no, without having to pass through all of those in front of you. So you pick those in front of you one at a time, right? So important in doing your CPM is identifying your CSFs, or critical success factors. So what are CSFs? Well, they are key areas which must be performed at the highest possible level of excellence if organizations want to succeed in that particular industry. Now, take note that when there are different organizations, different industries, there could be different factors. And if you are participating in more than one industry, you have to understand what factors would be applicable to you based on your decision on what industry you want to play in. Okay. So this critical success factors, you're not really the one defining it. It's really what the industry considers to be something successful. Okay. And as you know, just like in any other business, it's market driven. So if the market doesn't really like what you're selling, then no matter what you think about yourself, you're not successful, right? So the market tells you whether you're successful or not. So that's something that I want to point out off the bat right now. Okay. Okay, and then and they vary, as you said, they vary even within that industry. There could be large groups known as strategic groups or portfolios within that industry. They could have a different set of critical success factors. Now, how do you assign weights to the critical success factors? Typically, the total should be 100% or 1. And you just assign the importance. Okay, you assign the weights according to how important the factor is. Okay. Um, Now, if you don't assign weights, then you just assign weights equally. So just divide 100% across the number of factors, and those will be your weights. Okay. Now, you have to understand also that the factors, as much as possible, they are independent from one another, because it's possible that whatever affects one factor might automatically affect another factor. So there's this compounding effect, right? So when you assign or identify critical success factors independently from one another, uh, they should not influence other factors right away, right? So this is a term known as independence, okay? Independence of effects, wherein you want your factors to be okay. They can stand on their own, they're important, and they're not going to affect any of the other critical success factors at the same time. Okay. So, I mean, there will be a lot of uh, ways on how to assign weights. Who assigns the weights? Well, again, this is another subjective thing, right? I mean, uh, perhaps it could be a consensus of experts in that industry. Okay, that's how you define the weights, or it could be based on your assessment on the reality of the situation, which can also be based from your PESTLE analysis as well, right? And then the rating. So typically you use a 4-scale rating: 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 would be major weakness, 2 minor weakness, 3 minor strength, 4 major strength. Okay, so those are your typical ratings. But you have flexibility to use a different scale. If you want to use 6, maybe you want 3 and 4 to be somewhat neutral or in the middle. Okay, you can do that. But if you don't want to complicate things, 4 would be okay. A scale of 1 to 4 would be okay. Ratings as well as weights are also assigned subjectively. Okay, so it's based on your understanding of how things are. But the process can be done easier through benchmarking. So benchmarking, you have like a reference, right? So instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, you can assign one competitor or one player, then all of that, and that player or that reference would be 0. And then you try to rate the other players according to that benchmark. Okay. So in that case, you're not using a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. You're probably using a 0, +1, -1, +2, -2, those types of things. Okay. Sometimes it's easier that way, so that you can clearly see right away your comparisons. And also, when you choose a benchmark, you don't choose yourself as the benchmark. You choose somebody else as your benchmark, and then you rate everybody else, including yourself, in the process. Okay, now, at the end of it all, it's possible that firms can have the same rating for the same factor. That's fine. Okay, there's no need to be mathematically accurate, as I would say, right? Sometimes, okay, because it's subjective, it's okay to have equal weights or equal ratings for the same thing. That's fine. But you also have to be honest in your process, right? I mean, you don't just put everyone with equal rating because you're lazy. No, don't do that. Make sure that you are making the effort to be honest with your rating as much as possible. And then you total everything, you multiply the rating, individual rating with the weight, and then you sum everything up and you'll get a score. Okay. Um, and your score will, your total score for that matter, will tell you your relative positioning with everybody else. So obviously, the higher the score, the better you are with everybody else. And that's how CPM typically works. Okay, just as a reminder, I mean, at the end of it all, I mean, another tip that you want to look into is the idea of a smarter goal. And then their smarter goal will help you formulate your plans from a strategic level, okay? And then later on along the way, that would actually tailor all of the things that you need to do as far as executing your plan is concerned as monitor. So once you've identified your market, your situation, you can come up with a plan. And again, you're reminded of this framework or crutch known as the SMART or the smarter goal. Okay. And I will end the lecture here, the session here. I'd like to open the floor for questions if you have any.